A mournful morning by the fence in the Texas countryside. The cold early morning air in Mansfield, Texas, had a way of creeping into a person's bones, heavy with the scent of earth and quiet anticipation that something would finally stir on the road to the horizon. On December 3, 1995, that hush was broken not by songbirds or the distant hum of tractors, but by the grinding wheels of an old pickup belonging to Mr. Bill Turner, a local farmer whose sun-weathered hands knew every rut and pebble on this stretch of Texas backroad. As he made his regular round, boots caked in clay, mind shuffling through a to-do list of fixing old fences and checking the winter wheat, one thing kept nagging at him: a small flock of crows, unnaturally animated behind a barbed wire fence bordering his property. The birds cawed and swooped, pecking at something he couldn't see, their harsh black shapes darting like bad omens across the chilly gray dawn. Curious and slightly uneasy, Bill stepped off his truck, his breath fogging in the cold air, and approached the tangled wire with caution. There, half concealed among brittle weeds and the frost-laced underbrush, lay the body of a girl. For a brief second, as is sometimes the mercy of shock, her presence didn't register as tragedy, just a still figure, legs askew in running shorts, a gray t-shirt bunched awkwardly beneath her arm. The logo from a local cross-country race was stained with darkened patches he would later learn were blood, and the only sound was the uneasy shuffling of his boots as he came closer, heart pounding. Time slowed. He saw soft blonde hair, a delicate face frozen in a moment between rest and terror. Hands slack, fingers curled slightly as if clutching dreams unfinished. Even here, in the most private anguish of the prairie, her youth was unmistakable. A kid who could have been his own daughter or niece, out before daylight broke, maybe on a run, maybe just caught up in her own life. His own hands shook as he reached for the phone hanging on the truck's dashboard, the world narrowing to the endless siren wail in his head. Something terrible had happened, and someone must be missing this girl already. By the time the sheriff's cruiser pulled up, red and blue lights slicing through silver mist, the Turner place had become a scene of whispered disbelief. Neighbors with wide, worried eyes gathered just out of sight, murmurs passing faster than the wind. Someone recognized the running gear, sewn with the town's name, and between the badges and hushed voices, a name surfaced: Adrienne Jones. A 16-year-old, known for her bright spirit and sure stride, now lay silent in the field, where the grass would soon remember only how it cradled her last night on earth. For Mansfield, this discovery was more than tragedy. It was unthinkable. A tear in the fabric of calm, rural mornings. Parents clutched their own children tighter, casting nervous eyes at the school bus stop, wondering how such horror had come to their quiet world. Bill Turner, for the rest of his life, would never begin another morning without remembering the crows, the frigid dawn, and a silence broken so violently that nothing could quite heal it again. Prominent young woman murdered. As the investigation began to unravel on that cold Texas morning, the community would soon come to learn the full story of the remarkable young woman whose life had been so ruthlessly cut short. Adrienne Jones, or AJ, as her friends lovingly called her, wasn't just any girl in Mansfield. She was the kind of teenager who seemed destined for great things, her presence both memorable and magnetic. She shone in every room, drew people in with her mischievous smile, and never hesitated to speak up for what she believed was right. AJ possessed a natural beauty, golden blonde hair that seemed to catch the Texas sun at just the right angle, bright, engaging eyes, and an athletic stature honed through hours on the track. Her running shoes were almost as recognizable as her quick wit, because AJ wasn't just a top student, she was a star on the cross-country team. Every morning you could find her out at dawn, breath steaming in the crisp air, pounding the rural back roads for miles. Teachers noticed her tenacity, her willingness to help anyone struggling in class, and her teammates drew inspiration from how she could make even the hardest practices seem like games. But what made AJ truly special was her openness. She had that rare ability to connect with just about anyone, from nervous freshmen to the most intimidating upperclassmen. People confided in her. Her friends claimed she could keep a secret better than anyone, and her energy at pep rallies or local charity events made her a well-known face all through Mansfield. There was, however, a double edge to this popularity. With her effortless confidence and kindness, she sometimes attracted the envy of her peers, or the hidden frustrations of those who felt left behind in her wake. When the news spread that AJ had been killed, it sent a shockwave through the halls of Mansfield High. Teachers wept in the break room, Athletes on the field stood in shivering silence. The announcement turned otherwise lively corridors into somber paths of whispers and tears. Suddenly every small quarrel, every fleeting rivalry or hint of jealousy surrounding her took on a new menacing weight. Rumors multiplied, suspicion cast wide nets. It was unthinkable. How could a girl who embodied promise, resilience, and so much hope become the victim of such a shocking and brutal act? Neighbors and classmates brought flowers and cards to the edge of the field where she'd been found, the ribbons and teddy bears forming a makeshift memorial against the cold wire fence. Mourners lingered for hours, searching for answers that refused to come. In truth, Mansfield was mourning more than just a bright young runner. The town felt the loss of innocence, the shattering of a belief that their little slice of Texas was safe from the unthinkable. And in that ache, the legend of Adrienne Jones only grew, her spirit echoing in the silence left behind, her story becoming a heartbreaking rallying call for a justice that, for too long, seemed just out of reach. Clue from the crime scene. The first hours after AJ's body was found became a frantic, methodical flurry of police activity on that lonely Texas back road. When Sheriff Harris and his team arrived, the cold morning still hadn't burned off, and a heavy hush hung over the field, a moment stuck between disbelief and duty. Officers carefully established a perimeter, yellow police tape fluttering against the winter wind, keeping neighbors, the Turner family and farmhands, at a respectful distance. The crows from earlier had scattered, but their presence left an uneasy charm, a sense of something unnatural lingering in the air. The scene was, at first glance, shockingly clean of the usual chaos that attends a violent crime. There were no tire tracks off the road indicating a chase, no signs of a struggle in the frost-tinged weeds and dry grasses beneath the barbed wire fence. The girl herself, a slight, athletic teen, had no bindings, no bruises around her wrists or ankles, no cuts from a knife or evidence of being dragged. Her running shorts were askew only by the final violence perpetrated against her. The gray t-shirt she wore, emblazoned with the vivid lettering of her last cross-country meet, was stained by two dark, ominous patches. As they photographed her, it became clear. The wounds were the result of gunfire, cold and abrupt. Detectives spread out, eyes combing the scene for anything, footprints, fibers, cigarette butts, gum wrappers, minutiae that might speak of the killer or offer a clue. They bagged every possible scrap, careful not to disturb the truth hidden in the crushed grass. But the Texas frost preserved little. Whatever had happened, it had been quick and calculated. Somewhere in that silent morning, the investigators saw a different story forming. This wasn't a random assault or sex crime. There was no evidence of sexual violence, no torn clothing or scratched skin, nothing to suggest the girl was forced from her home by brute strength or threat. Her hands rested softly, palms up, fingers curved as though she'd never had the chance to fend anyone off at all. A careful search along the fence line yielded few surprises, no signs of forced entry, no dropped weapons, no scattered belongings of the victim or perpetrator. It almost seemed as if the killer had vanished into the crisp morning air, leaving nothing but grief and questions. The killer had known what they were doing and hadn't lingered. More than anything, the death scene told of cold intent. Someone knew Adrienne, wanted her dead, and carried out the act with controlled, chilling precision. Though the landscape was vast, in those first hours, law enforcement's best evidence lay not on the ground but in what wasn't there, the missing chaos, the missing resistance. The only thing that lingered apart from bewilderment was the grim reality that Mansfield had just become a town forever marked by one perfect, unanswerable crime. The fateful night and the mysterious pickup truck. The night of December 3, 1995, played out like 100 other quiet evenings in Mansfield, Texas. A rural hush settled over the darkened roofs, distant dogs barking in the cold, frost clinging to unmown grass. Inside the Jones family home, the ordinary rituals of small-town life played out. Adrienne, bright-eyed and full of energy after a long weekend, chatted on the phone, first with Tracy, her new boyfriend, whose voice made her laugh even over a crackling landline, then with David, her cross-country teammate whose dependable calm always put her at ease. Her parents had no reason to think this Sunday, out of all the Sundays, would change everything. After her goodnight calls, Adrienne switched off the lights, the familiar hush of her room broken only by the distant sound of her brother watching TV down the hall. But sometime not long after, the familiar settled into the strange, a muffled noise outside, an engine idling along the curb, followed by headlights slicing through the edges of her window shade. Her younger brother, half asleep, caught a glimpse through the window. A pickup truck, shape unremarkable, engine rumbling low, tires crunching over gravel, before rolling away into the night. Too drowsy to worry, he drifted back to sleep, never realizing he'd just witnessed the last moments his sister would ever spend at home. Outside, the night was bone-chillingly quiet. No neighbors noticed anything unusual. The pickup's headlights washed momentarily over fences and dormant flower beds, then were gone, blending back into the great Texan dark. There were no screams, no signs of struggle, not a bang or the slamming of a door. Just that single, inexplicable vehicle, and the way the silence afterwards seemed somehow deeper than before. Morning brought the terrible gravity of the unknown. Adrianne's room was empty, bed made, covers barely disturbed. Her running shoes stood neatly by the dresser, untouched. Her mother, uneasy, made calls around town. She double-checked with David, but he denied ever calling back later, his voice calm but dismissive, offering nothing unusual to note. It would be hours before they realized just how critical that brief glimpse of the pickup, that fleeting engine rumble in the cold, would become. To the investigators, that mystery truck would grow into a phantom, a specter at the heart of the investigation, a moving shadow that seemed to carry all the answers, if only someone knew where it had gone, or who had been behind the wheel that night. Suspects gradually emerged and then were gradually eliminated. As the investigation into Adrianne Jones's murder pressed on, the small-town calm of Mansfield was quickly shattered by a parade of whispered suspicions and potential suspects who one by one entered and exited the circle of inquiry. The Texas authorities, faced with immense pressure from a grieving community and ravenous local media, knew they had to be thorough. Every angle, every alibi, every ounce of motive had to be dissected. Yet what made this case all the more chilling was how each new thread seemed plausible, only to unravel as facts came to light, keeping everyone on edge and desperately grasping for the truth. The initial wave of scrutiny naturally fell upon those in Adrianne's immediate orbit, especially the boys she had been connected with the night before her death. Suspicion first landed heavily on Tracy, the new boyfriend who had spoken to her on the phone that very evening. In the emotional fog that always follows a tragedy, friends and classmates speculated wildly. Was there jealousy? Had a lover's quarrel escalated? Tracy was brought in for questioning, his every word analyzed for cracks or signs of deception. But despite the undercurrent of gossip, his alibi, rooted in the testimony of family members and time-stamped phone logs, held up against even the most skeptical detectives. Polygraph exams, though always imperfect, returned inconclusive at first but were eventually supported by corroborating details. Tracy, distraught and visibly shaken, was ultimately cleared. Yet the brief focus on him left wounds, both in his heart and in the way his peers would view him from that moment on. Next, attention turned to those who recently had any kind of conflict with Adrianne. A few names floated up from the school rumor mill: a jealous cheerleader, an ex-friend harboring resentment over a perceived slight, a teammate who had argued with her at practice just days before. Each was methodically interviewed by officers, who combed through their schedules, phone records, and text messages. Some even offered up their personal journals and day planners, eager to be believed, desperate to clear their names. In every case, however, the evidence failed to pin down a motive or opportunity. The school's usual background noise of adolescent tension, petty dramas and heated exchanges, proved superficial in light of the violence Adrianne had suffered. As the search broadened, the detectives also learned not to rule out anyone by age or proximity, recalling famous cases where the perpetrator had been hiding in plain sight. Teachers, parents of teammates, even a track coach once briefly considered an outsider, were discreetly checked out. Some townsfolk grumbled that the police were wasting time going after popular or respected adults, but the exhaustive scope of the inquiry was, if nothing else, a testament to the gravity of the loss Mansfield had suffered. Ultimately, those avenues also yielded nothing. Then there was David, the longtime classmate and trusted friend, whose relationship with Adrianne was characterized more by shared athletic triumphs and late-night team strategy sessions than by rivalry or romance. David's name came up primarily because he'd been on the phone with Adrianne the night she died, just before the fateful hour. Though he seemed an unlikely perpetrator, the investigation protocol required that detectives track his whereabouts down to the minute. David, though initially nervous, provided a clear account and was backed up by his parents and call logs. He even wrote a length statement in his own hand, describing his conversation with AJ in detail, Their worries about the upcoming meet, her excitement about the weekend, and little else that suggested something was amiss. Polygraph tests showed no sign of deception, and just like Tracy, David was eventually set aside as a suspect. The detectives, refusing to rest, widened the net even further. They canvassed the neighborhoods, looking for local troublemakers or anyone with a reputation for instability. One particular young man, Brian Thornton, quickly caught the attention of authorities. Brian had long been an outlier, a misfit with an erratic history, difficult family circumstances, and an obsession with several girls at school, including Adrienne. People whispered about his unpredictable nature, rumored drug use, and alleged brushes with the law. Concerned that mental health struggles might have boiled into violent action, the police brought him in for intensive questioning. For hours, Brian was grilled about his movements, state of mind, any specific memories that might place him near the rural back road on that fateful night. Yet, for all his oddness, Brian was no murderer. His presence at a nearby bowling alley was documented by a half-dozen witnesses, and surveillance tapes bore out his timeline. His release, though, did little to quiet the speculative chatter that ran through town like wildfire. At each turn, what mystified the authorities and tormented the community was just how quickly each potential lead, so promising in the heat of discovery, collapsed under scrutiny. Days stretched into weeks, school resumed, but a shadow lingered over every hallway and locker. Rumors mutated, fueled by fear and frustration. Law enforcement had to go back time and time again to the cold, unyielding facts of the crime, the calculated nature of the attack, the lack of any defensive wounds, and the absence of physical evidence like fingerprints or foreign DNA. Working late into the night, investigators gathered at folding tables in the sheriff's office, their walls covered with maps, timelines, and the tacked-up faces of each would-be suspect, all with thick red lines crossing them out, one by one. Parents, desperate for answers, hounded the authorities. Local journalists, sensing the beginning of what would become a national story, camped out for any new information. Candlelight vigils and church meetings, meant for solace, sometimes dissolved into heated arguments about the true nature of evil, and whether Mansfield was really the quiet sanctuary it had always claimed to be. Behind closed doors and drawn curtains, some residents even wondered aloud if the killer would ever be found, or if some terrible secret was festering beneath the surface of ordinary life. Slowly, yet inevitably, the list of suspects thinned, and possibilities dried up. The community faced a gut-wrenching reality. Whoever had taken Adrienne Jones's life had not acted out of simple jealousy or schoolyard rage, but out of a motive and calculation that was still well hidden. The police, their resources stretched, began to fear the case might become another unsolved tragedy until, months later, a strange break would shatter the silence and lead them down a completely unanticipated path. For a brief, dreadful period, though, Mansfield existed in a twilight of suspicion, every neighbor both a comfort and a potential threat, every shadow on the prairie a possible veil for the unknown killer lurking just out of reach. Brian and the darkness of depression. Brian Thornton's name began surfacing in whispers before it ever reached the official investigation's spotlight. Mansfield was a community where the edges between neighborly concern and rumor blurred all too easily. Once word spread about Brian's troubled demeanor and his admitted fixation on Adrienne Jones, anxiety quickly curdled into suspicion. By the end of the week following AJ's murder, Brian's life was under a microscope. Every odd glance or solitary walk through his neighborhood reinterpreted as evidence that he was hiding some dark secret. To understand why suspicion pivoted toward Brian, it's essential to know something about his past. Brian didn't fit the archetypal image of the town's athletic, cheerful teenagers. While most kids spent weekends at church events or high school football games, Brian could often be found sitting by himself on the edge of the local creek, sketching in a battered notebook or silently skipping stones. His family life was turbulent. His parents' strained marriage filled their home with tension, and by age 15, Brian had cycled through more counselors and school psychologists than anyone else in his grade. He rarely smiled in the hallways, and when he did, it was often fleeting and uncertain. Brian's battle with depression was more than a rumor. School counselors had tried, often in vain, to offer him support, but his internal world was one he rarely felt comfortable sharing with others. This emotional isolation, coupled with rumors of unrequited affection for Adrienne, threw Brian into the eye of the storm. It wasn't long before investigators arrived at the small, neglected house on the edge of town, their flashlights sweeping over Brian's skittish form as his parents looked on nervously. The questions were immediate and pointed. What did he know about AJ's final hours? Had he seen her the night she was killed? Did his feelings for her ever cross a line into jealousy or obsession? In those first interviews, Brian's answers were quiet, barely above a whisper. He admitted to thinking AJ was beautiful, and that her kindness to him in gym class had meant a great deal. He confessed to daydreaming sometimes about what it would be like to have her as a friend or more, fantasies that, in the harsh light of suspicion, suddenly seemed insidious. The officers pressed him about his whereabouts the night of the murder, but Brian seemed confused by the attention. He stumbled through his account, trying to remember what he did. The sense of dread was palpable, in his sleepy eyes, in his shaking hands, in his inability to meet anyone's gaze for more than a moment. Mental illness complicated things. There were days Brian didn't leave his room, and others when he wandered the town at odd hours just to clear his head. His journals were filled with rambling thoughts, sketches of faceless figures, and sometimes short poems about loneliness or the desire to belong. As detectives flipped through these pages searching for anything incriminating, they found nothing directly connecting him to AJ's death, but plenty to suggest a fragile, struggling soul. Still, mental instability paired with rumor was enough for neighbors to start drawing their own damning conclusions. The police didn't stop at talking. Brian was subjected to a series of polygraph tests, each more grueling than the last. The results were, as they so often are, agonizingly inconclusive. One test suggested truthfulness, the next flagged deceptive responses, a cycle that only prolonged the agony. Detectives retraced his steps for hours, interviewing local store clerks, poring over surveillance tape from a nearby bowling alley. Eventually, a clear alibi emerged. Brian had been at the alley, awkward and out of place, but unmistakably present, for hours on the night in question. Several witnesses affirmed his presence, including the cashier who'd served him a soda and the manager who remembered his nervous demeanor. Even as law enforcement cleared his name, Brian couldn't shake the stigma the investigation left behind. In school, whispers trailed him in every hallway. Former friends avoided his desk, classes he once enjoyed became battlegrounds for silent accusations. Teachers, though sympathetic, held their own reservations, wondering silently how much they really understood about the troubled boy in the back row. His parents, once private about his mental health, watched helplessly as their son became the center of a cautionary tale whispered in supermarket lines and church pews. Depression, for Brian, was no longer just an internal struggle. It had become public property, dissected and speculated upon by people who'd never spoken to him for more than a moment. He alternated between anger and helplessness. Sometimes he lashed out, other times he retreated fully into himself. His counselors reported a worsening in mood and self-esteem, a sharp fall-off from even the fragile progress they'd seen before the incident. Therapy sessions became longer, more complicated. It was hard to separate the original sadness from the new scars layered on by suspicion. Perhaps the most painful consequence was how suspicion ruined the one thing it's supposed to preserve: safety. Brian's family began locking their doors at night. He was admonished by strangers not to return to certain stores, his mailbox occasionally stuffed with strange, threatening notes. At no point did the police or school declare him guilty, but the absence of guilt was never enough to fully restore his reputation. In the end, Brian Thornton's ordeal stands as a stark testament to the complicated intersections of mental illness, adolescent longing, and small-town suspicion. Even after all charges were dropped and his alibi confirmed, life in Mansfield never returned to normal. The Whisper network only shifted, attaching new faces to old fears. Brian disappeared from public view not long after, either by choice or necessity, leaving behind a community that had failed to distinguish rumor from reality, and a tragic reminder of how easily a broken heart can become a scapegoat when the world is desperate for answers. The case seemed deadlocked, then suddenly exploded. For months, Mansfield seemed to hover beneath a cloud that would never break. Investigators had worked every angle, talked to every person twice over, and still the question of who killed Adrian Jones had no answer. The case file on the sheriff's desk had grown thick with interviews, dead-end leads, and slowly yellowing photographs. Detectives traded half-hearted theories in low tones, all haunted by the same silent truth. The avenue of hope was closing. Another winter passed, and for the Jones family and the entire town a strange numbness set in, a resilience and a resignation. Some townsfolk whispered that real justice might never come. Adrian's friends left flowers by the fence less often. Police, once omnipresent on the back roads, turned their focus elsewhere. Even Mr. Turner, the farmer who'd found AJ that fateful morning, began to avoid the edge of his property where tragedy had rooted itself into the soil. But just as the world resigned itself to never knowing, a jarring phone call jolted the case back to life. In August 1996, nearly 9 months after AJ's murder, the desk phone at the Mansfield Sheriff's Department rang. On the line were 2 young women from the prestigious United States Naval Academy in Annapolis, a place worlds away from the slow sprawl of Texas farm country. Their voices strained, the students recounted an unnerving late-night confession made by their roommate, Diane Zamora. Through choked sobs and relentless guilt, Diane had admitted to the unthinkable. She was directly involved in the murder of Adrian Jones, together with her high school sweetheart, David Graham. The call, initially met with disbelief, sent shockwaves through both the sheriff's office and the Jones family. Investigators scrambled to verify details. The girls described specifics of the crime scene, the barbed wire fence, the condition of Adrian's clothing, the fatal gunshot wounds, that had never been published publicly. It was information only someone present could possibly know. The case, barely breathing, suddenly had a pulse again. Detectives jumped into action. The information was relayed to law enforcement in both Texas and the military academies David and Diane attended. Military police were dispatched to secure the pair before news of the investigation could reach them through the rumor mill. For the first time in months, the sense of a break, real evidence, real opportunity, galvanized investigators as they dusted off their files and braced themselves for what might finally resolve Mansfield's lingering grief. The narrative that slowly unraveled was nothing short of Shakespearean. A tale not just of murder, but of warped love, jealousy, and ambition colliding with tragedy. Diane Zamora and David Graham had been something of a golden couple in high school, intelligent, ambitious, and many believed, destined for greatness. Diane had just begun her studies at the Naval Academy. David was a newly enrolled cadet at the U.S. Air Force Academy in Colorado. They had gone their separate ways geographically, but their relationship, intense, all-consuming, and, as it turned out, deeply troubled, stayed an ominous anchor to their shared past. Once brought into custody, the wall of silence between Diane and David cracked almost instantly in the hands of skilled investigators. Within hours of questioning, both began to talk, at first blaming the other, then haltingly revealing details that lined up with evidence and filled in the missing pieces. Diane, shaking and exhausted, told of a night when David allegedly confessed to a brief, regrettable flirtation with Adrian Jones, perhaps an impulsive kiss after a team event. That admission seared Diane with a rage and humiliation she couldn't shake. In her telling, it was she who demanded a reckoning. She convinced David that his betrayal must be paid in blood, and together, they plotted a night that would end a life and change so many more forever. The plan, as reconstructed from diaries, confessions, and ever-widening circles of testimony, was chilling in its banality. David lured Adrian out under the pretense of a drive and a talk. Diane, hidden in the back seat, waited in the darkness as the ride began. The trio headed to a remote stretch near Joe Pool Lake, ironically a lover's hangout spot meant for laughter and secrets shared, not violence. There, in a confrontation that must have frozen AJ with betrayal and terror, Diane and David confronted her, accusing her of destroying their bond. The night ended with the unthinkable, violence fueled by jealousy, fear, and the desperate need for control. Police corroborated the timetable through phone logs, mileage on David's old car, and, most tellingly, a chilling entry in Diane's calendar that coldly marked the night of the crime. Adrian, 1:38. What followed was a desperate attempt by the couple to erase their deed from memory and suspicion. David and Diane attended funerals, comforted friends, and then parted ways, each heading to their respective academies. For months they steeled themselves into silence, the pressure and paranoia mounting, until finally the dam broke and Diane's guilt spilled out, hundreds of miles from the Texas field where AJ's life had ended. Mansfield awoke to the news like a town struck by lightning. Rumors raced faster than the facts. Friends who had seen Diane and David as their best and brightest reeled in disbelief. For the Jones family, a new grief compounded the old. There would never be true closure, only the rough comfort of accountability and the bitter truth that the very people entrusted with their daughter's friendship had destroyed her. Even hardened investigators flinched at the banality of the motive: teen jealousies, pride, the aching need to belong. The shockwaves reached far beyond Texas, drawing national attention and plenty of armchair theories. The case was no longer just a local tragedy, but a cautionary tale of ambition, obsession, and America's ongoing struggle to comprehend youth violence. In the end, justice moved swiftly. Both Diane and David were indicted, tried, and ultimately sentenced to life for a killing that stripped Mansfield of its innocence and left the Jones family permanently altered. The revelation of who and why offered a strange sort of solace and an unending litany of new wounds. Parents sighed relief and locked their doors more tightly. Teenagers navigated friendships a little more warily. The case, long thought cold, will forever stand as proof that even in the darkest, most stagnant moments, the truth can emerge, brought forth by remorse, by courage, and by those stubborn few who refuse to let memory die. From the perfect couple to an unforgivable crime. From the outside, Diane Zamora and David Graham appeared to be the portrait of youthful ambition and small-town promise, a couple forged in the fires of adolescent achievement and the hope that comes from defying expectations. Their lives had long run parallel lines through the hallways of Mansfield High, where each shone in their own right. Diane, the driven, disciplined honor student with a laser focus on every goal she set, and David, the charismatic athlete whose leadership on the track field and charm in the classroom earned him widespread admiration. Together they looked like a storybook match. They were the couple, the kind that parents quietly wished their own teenagers would emulate. The pair who made good grades, volunteered at community events, and were accepted into two of the nation's elite military academies, Diane to the Naval Academy and David to the Air Force Academy. Yet beneath the gleaming surface of their success lay a relationship built on volatility, intensity, and the simmering pressure of high expectations. Both teenagers were, in their own ways, perfectionists, unwilling to settle for mediocrity, terrified of letting themselves or each other down. What began as harmless possessiveness soon metastasized into dependency. They traded hundreds of phone calls and letters even after heading to different states. Their private conversations often veered into emotional territory that no two 18-year-olds should have to navigate. Simply put, Diane and David became each other's obsessions, their identities increasingly intertwined until it became hard to tell where one ambition ended and the other's began. It was this all-consuming attachment, as later revealed in confessions and psychiatric evaluations, that became the dark crucible for a crime the town could never fathom. How the drive to be exceptional, to control, and to be wanted at any cost could tip love into hate and finally into violence. The catalyst was jealousy, but not the garden variety kind that flickers and fades among high schoolers. Diane, devastated by David's tearful confession that he had once shared an intimate moment with Adrienne Jones, a brief, impulsive kiss by some accounts, saw in this moment not merely a betrayal, but the shattering of her entire self-image. To the outside world, Diane still functioned at the highest level. Inside, humiliation twisted into rage, eroding her judgment and magnifying her insecurities. For David, the lines between right and wrong blurred under the acute pressure to prove his love to the only person he felt truly understood him. The escalation from heartbreak to homicidal intent was frighteningly swift, though its seeds were planted long before. Diane's emotional volatility had led to previous conflicts, tears, threats, nights spent pacing her bedroom in restless fury. But this time the parameters were irrevocably changed. She insisted that for their relationship to survive, something drastic had to be done to cleanse the perceived stain on their bond. Over long-distance calls late into the night, they fed each other's darkest impulses until the impossible began to seem inevitable. The prospect of violence, once unthinkable, became a grotesque form of devotion, a ritual necessary to purge the past. David's own struggles factored heavily into this toxic spiral. Desperate to maintain Diane's approval and fearful of her threats of self-harm and abandonment, he became pliable, eager to please, terrified to lose her, unable to separate her demands from reality. The psychologist later described their relationship as a feedback loop, each partner's insecurities stoking the other's, tightening the emotional vice until there was no room for outside reason. Diaries taken from both Diane and David after their arrest would detail the elaborate private world they'd constructed, filled with coded language, oaths of loyalty, and chilling acceptance that their love required a sacrifice. For both of them, the notion of stepping away felt even more dangerous than any act they might commit together. Once the decision was made, the planning began in earnest and with an eerie composure that would later leave everyone, Detectives, jurors, even their own family members, struggling to reconcile this cold logic with their memories of the perfect couple. They spoke over the phone about logistics, mapped out alibis, rehearsed the moments that would lead up to the crime. Diane kept notes, scribbled reminders and dates, treating the plot as if it were just another high-stakes academic competition. David made the arrangements to contact Adrienne Jones, offering her a ride under false pretenses. The weapon, a handgun, was secured, cloaked in the casual preparations of two driven young adults determined to see their plan through. When the night finally came, it unfolded with an awful inevitability. Both Diane and David later recounted feeling as though they were actors in someone else's story, compelled more by momentum than by a conscious choice. In the moments leading up to the murder, with Adrienne unaware of the peril she was in, the atmosphere inside that car was stifling, tension and nervous energy thickening the air, unspoken resentments and fears pulsing between the three teenagers. What happened next was not a crime of spontaneous rage, but a calculated collective act, born out of a months-long descent into darkness. For the community, learning the full extent of Diane and David's crime was to experience a shattering loss of faith, not only in these two young people, but in the illusion that achievement and promise are enough to keep tragedy at bay. The fact that Diane, by many accounts the most self-disciplined, rule-following student in her graduating class, could become the architect of a murder bespoke a chilling truth about human complexity. The diaries and letters seized after their arrest did not read like the angry scrawls of sociopaths. Rather, they were filled with the language of longing and devastation, of isolation and the desperate will to belong to someone, to something, at any cost. In the aftermath, their relationship was dissected in courtrooms and the media alike. Both families suffered public scrutiny. Neighbors agonized over what warning signs they might have missed. Teachers questioned whether they had placed too much faith in their students' ability to handle pressure. Diane's defense would later argue that she acted under the coercive spell of a controlling boyfriend, while David's statements painted a picture of a young man dominated by Diane's emotional demands. The truth, as with so many tragedies, was likely more complicated, a fusion of autonomy and manipulation, pride and fear, love and the utter inability to escape from it. Ultimately, what had once been Mansfield's pride and joy, its most promising couple on the cusp of national service, became a cautionary tale echoing far beyond Texas. The trial revealed agonizing contributions from friends, teachers, and counselors, many of whom testified to the pressure cooker environment in which Diane and David tried, and catastrophically failed, to maintain perfection. Media coverage turned them overnight from local heroes to national infamy, their carefully cultivated images forever tarnished. The sense of betrayal lingered for years, a silent reminder that even those we think we know best can harbor wounds deep enough to drive them to the unthinkable. The story of Diane Zamora and David Graham is not merely a chronicle of envy taken to the ultimate extreme, it is a searing exploration of obsession, the myth of invulnerability, and the hidden fragilities beneath accomplished exteriors. Their legacy became a point of somber reflection for Mansfield, on the limits of ambition, the power of unchecked emotion, and how, sometimes, the perfect pair can conceal an unforgivable crime just beneath the surface. The deadly trap under the cold moonlight. The night air was unseasonably chilled, a hazy Texas moon riding low above the whispering prairie, as Diane Zamora and David Graham hatched the final irreversible act of their tragic conspiracy. The world, for a time, seemed to pay no attention to what was about to unfold, just another Friday lost to stars and crickets, while in reality, it was about to be the scene of one of Mansfield's most horrifying betrayals. David drove with calculated calm, his fingers gripping the steering wheel tighter the closer he came to Adrienne Jones's house. His mind buzzed with nervous plans and rehearsed reassurances, the kind of jangling focus that sometimes masks deeper panic. Diane hid in the back seat, her breath shallow, heart pounding so hard she worried it would give her away even before the plan began. Both knew they'd crossed some invisible line from which there was no return. Even so, the moon and the quiet did nothing to soften their resolve, only to make the coming violence feel all the more surreal. Earlier that evening, David had called Adrienne under the casual pretense of needing someone to talk to, offering her a late-night ride she never imagined would become fatal. For Adrienne, a talented athlete and ever-loyal friend, there was no reason to suspect anything more sinister than the turbulence of teenage secrets. She slipped out, careful not to wake her family, and slid into the passenger seat, her last journey, unknown to her, already set in motion by hearts poisoned with jealousy. Their blue pickup cruised through quiet suburban roads before leaving the safety of familiar neighborhoods, eventually winding toward the deserted woods by Joe Pool Lake, a spot known to those in town as a place for clandestine teenage gatherings, not murder. Diane, completely still in the back seat, waited for the moment rehearsed countless times in whispers and anxious late-night calls. Adrienne, meanwhile, let her guard down as David made shallow conversation, perhaps talking about school, track, or idle gossip, all the while hiding his true purpose. As they crossed into the desolate area near Joe Pool Lake, the atmosphere in the car turned thick and charged, every shadow outside the window gaining new menace. David chose a dark, unlit stretch by the water. He parked and killed the engine. The world around them fell eerily silent. No headlights, just the cold moon glinting on the rippling surface of the lake. David turned to Adrienne, stilted now, his voice lower. This was the signal. Without a word, Diane emerged from the back seat, her entrance shocking and abrupt. Adrienne barely had time to register confusion before the mood changed completely. The two confronted her, Diane's anger spilling over, a cocktail of wounded pride and burning humiliation fueling every accusation. Diane demanded the truth about Adrienne's supposed flirtation with David. Her voice trembled, teetering between tears and rage, forcing Adrienne to deny, to explain, all the while bewildered by the intensity and absurdity of what she was being accused. The confrontation dragged on, tension mounting, the cold car a claustrophobic warren of conflicting emotions. The moon outside was a silent watcher, bearing witness as the illusion of teenage innocence shattered within those car doors. Adrienne tried to reason with Diane, insisting she had done nothing wrong, her voice cracking with fear and frustration. David, for his part, oscillated between backing Diane's story and wavering regret. Yet, in that moment, reason could not reach Diane. The harm had already been imagined, stoked and rehearsed until it felt inescapably real. The narrative, twisted by paranoia and sorrow, left Adrienne with no way out. Out in the oppressive darkness, Diane's sense of betrayal boiled over, her words flared and the confrontation turned physical. What started as accusations quickly escalated. Adrienne struggled, confusion becoming terror. The violence that followed was shocking in its brevity and finality. David, standing as both accomplice and executioner, drew the weapon, his hands shaking, face ghostly in the moon's glow. Diane's voice broke the silence once more, a shrill, harrowing command or plea, no one would ever fully agree which, and suddenly the night fractured as the gun fired. In those seconds everything changed. The sound of the shot echoed down to the lake, startling birds from their roosts and gawking silently at a horror they could neither understand nor deny. Adrienne's body crumpled to the cold earth, her life snuffed out in an act that felt at once impossible and inevitable. The cruel clarity of what they had done struck both Diane and David. The script they had written for themselves, so meticulously rehearsed, collided with the stark, irreversible fact of murder. For a moment, the only witnesses to Adrienne's final moments were her killers, the indifferent moon, and the chill wind off the water. Neither Diane nor David spoke as they lifted Adrienne's body from the vehicle, each step awkward and heavy as if gravity itself sought to drag them down. Their teenage bravado ruptured, leaving behind only shaking hands and wide, haunted eyes. They left Adrienne lying near the barbed wire fence, concealed by wild grass and half-frozen weeds, a final mockery of the safety and belonging she once knew in this small Texas town. With every hurried movement they tried to erase their presence, brushing away footprints, wiping at the interior of the truck, and collecting any hint that the night's events had ever touched them. The moon, now shrouded by drifting clouds, cast the entire scene in ghostly relief. Diane and David climbed back into the pickup without exchanging another word. The drive back through sleeping subdivisions and blinking traffic lights was silent and endless. The air inside the truck stank of panic and loss, the engine running too loud. Both of them knew nothing could ever return to normal. Their relationship, once obsessive, dizzying, predicated on the myth of togetherness, had been reduced to a shared silence more chilling than the act itself. That night, as families across Mansfield slept unaware under the same lunar glow, the landscape of all their lives subtly shifted. The deadly trap set under the cold moonlight had not only ended one young life but also irreparably destroyed two more, casting an unshakable shadow over an entire town. In the weeks that followed, the community would search fruitlessly for answers. But on that night by the lake, the truth wore the face of tragedy, lit only by the unblinking, pitiless gaze of the Texas moon. The cover-up scheme and the haunting diary. In the fraught aftermath of the murder, the sense of panic gripping Diane Zamora and David Graham did not dissipate. It morphed into an elaborate, desperate campaign of concealment. Where the violence of that night had been swift and chaotic, their attempts to cover their tracks became methodical, almost obsessive. For both teenagers, the shock had not brought an urge to confess or even to grieve. Instead, their keen instincts for self-preservation, honed by years of high achievement and expectations, kicked into overdrive. They meticulously inventoried each memory of the night, what they had touched, what they might have left behind. The truck's interior was scrubbed. They wiped down door handles, seat covers, and even the dashboard, convinced that the smallest fingerprint or strand of Diane's hair could signal their undoing. Muddy footprints were feared, clothing was burned or hidden. They rehearsed their stories, shoring up alibis with facts manufactured on the spot. David double-checked his mileage, recalculating the drive through Mansfield and the remote roads by Joe Pool Lake. Diane clipped out articles from the newspaper as if cataloging a nightmare, following every new rumor or revelation within the investigation, desperate to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. What made their efforts eerier was Diane's compulsive record-keeping. She'd grown up chronicling her triumphs, awards, exams, rivalries, in neat, slanted script inside her journals and planners. Now that same discipline turned chilling. Rather than expressions of guilt, her notations were coldly factual. Dates, times, one-word reminders. On her calendar, amid the mess of homework deadlines and practice schedules, she inked the phrase Adrienne 138, a timestamp matching the moment of tragedy. It was a clinical entry, free of emotion, trapped in the banality of day-to-day planning. A chilling artifact investigators would later seize upon as proof not only of complicity, but of premeditation. For Diane, the journals became both a shield and a lifeline, a way to return to the language of order in a life that felt on the verge of collapse. Sporadic entries, scrawled at odd hours, vacillated between mundane high school concerns and cryptic allusions to the mistake or the night. There were pages where she would write and rewrite the same sentence as if trying to render the horror inert with repetition. She noted the tone of David's voice in their calls, marked the days she had lied to her mother, the restless nights when sleep would not come. Ironically, the meticulousness that served her so well as a student only made her evidence more damning when the truth finally emerged. Meanwhile, David handled his anxiety with detachment. He calculated timelines and kept up appearances as if his life was still in perfect order. At school, he laughed with team members, discussed college plans, even attended Adrienne's funeral with an appropriately somber expression. If he felt haunted, he rarely showed it except in odd moments of silence or distraction, something only a handful of friends ever noticed. Privately, he obsessively replayed the plan. What they did right, what could go wrong, how he'd respond if the police ever came knocking. David's letters to Diane, most discarded or destroyed, occasionally showed a crack in his armor. He worried aloud, posed hypotheticals about polygraph results, and sometimes insisted they had no choice but to stick together, as if unity itself could inoculate them from the consequences. The pressure, however, seeped into every crevice of their lives. The burden of their secret drew Diane and David even closer, even as it eroded trust and fueled new levels of anxiety. Each misstep, an unexpected question from a parent, a slip of memory about the route they took, a sudden rumor at school, spiked their paranoia. Diane confided less in friends and became more withdrawn, reading news articles late at night, rehearsing lines of potential defense in her mirror. Her journal entries, late in the winter of 1996, began to hint at dread. Can't sleep, can't let anything slip. What if they know? What if I forget something? But the real test of their cover-up was time. Days bled into weeks, then months, and the case began to cool. No arrests were made. The police, grasping at weak leads and distracted by red herrings, lost the scent. Both Diane and David left for their respective military academies, believing not only that they had gotten away with murder, but that distance itself was an added shield. New routines, new acquaintances, and the trappings of adulthood momentarily dulled their panic. Diane replaced the physical journals with guarded phone calls, coded emails, and rare, tense visits when their academic schedules aligned. David poured his energy into training, carrying the legacy of his secret as a dark badge of discipline. Despite appearances, dread never truly left. Diane found sleep elusive. The past haunted her in flashes and dreams. Sometimes, seized by guilt or an urge to unburden herself, she would pen letters she never sent, listing again and again every detail of the night and its aftermath. Occasionally she toyed with the idea of confession, writing imaginary versions she'd recite in her mind, but the fear always outweighed the possibility of closure. She watched her own signature on that calendar grow older and yellow, an ugly watermark on the narrative she told herself. The calendar became a silent judge, a damning witness lurking in her luggage wherever she moved. David's mask, too, began to fracture. Those closest to him noticed he became more volatile, flipping from charisma to irritability in a heartbeat. Nights at the academy brought nightmares. He'd wake up sweating, the sound of the gunshot echoing in his ears, Adrian's confused eyes blinking up at him from the dark. He withdrew from some of his old friends back home, stopped writing letters except to Diane. His grades slipped. The idea of being found out became a phantom, sometimes a distant threat, sometimes an imminent doom. It was Diane's guilt, ultimately, that turned their clever cover-up inside out. Her journals, her confessions written in the dark, the slow erosion of her own emotional stability all combined to culminate in the midnight tearful confession to her Naval Academy roommates. Those nighttime revelations, blurted between sobs, contained the same precise, unemotional detail she had once scribbled in her planner. Places, times, orders, the unyielding truth of the secret they shared. In trying so hard to maintain control and keep her world orderly, she had unintentionally sealed her and David's fate. The discovery of those calendars and diaries stunned investigators, later forming the backbone of their case. To law enforcement, it was the rarest kind of evidence, a first-person, day-by-day roadmap that chronicled not only the crime, but the stunted efforts to escape its consequences. For Mansfield, the existence of such a record was both shocking and perversely fitting. In a town obsessed with discipline, order, and achievement, the final proof of one of its darkest acts came in the form of one girl's unflinching and unforgivable commitment to documentation. The truth exposed and the desperate confession withdrawal. The long-shrouded truth of the crime, hidden perfectly for months behind layers of paranoia, manipulation, and clever orchestration, at last exploded into the open with the kind of force that could only follow months of tension. For the small town of Mansfield and everyone involved in the Adrian Jones case, the moment when Diane Zamora and David Graham were unmasked was less a simple revelation than an earthquake, one that rattled through every assumption, loyalty, and fragile peace the community had managed to cobble together in the aftermath of tragedy. The unraveling began with the unexpected, Diane Zamora's tearful, guilt-ridden confession to her Naval Academy roommates. These late-night whispered truths, poured out amid sobs in the dim lights of a freshman dorm room, shocked her peers more than any drunken drama or whispered rumor. The roommates, at first paralyzed by the sheer horror of what Diane described, struggled with disbelief. But as Diane became more detailed, referencing specifics never made public, the barbed wire, bloodstains on Adrian's shirt, the precise location by Joe Pool Lake, their fear grew. Confusion soon gave way to responsibility. The two roommates did what few could imagine. They placed a call to the Mansfield Sheriff's Department, not out of spite, but sheer moral necessity. Their voices trembled as they recounted Diane's words. On the law enforcement end, disbelief initially reigned. Months had passed since the murder. Tips had dried up, leads had gone cold, and the idea that a confession could come from halfway across the country seemed almost delusional. But as officers pressed for more details, things only the killer or an eyewitness would know, it became clear these women were unwitting conveyors of a truth too heavy to bear alone. Investigators pounced on the break. Jurisdictional authorities from Texas to Annapolis and Colorado Springs, where David attended the Air Force Academy, mobilized with a coordination and urgency unseen for months. Both Diane and David were questioned separately, each caught off guard by the sudden toppling of their carefully constructed realities. In those interrogations, the fragile unity they once shared, cemented by guilt and necessity, fractured almost immediately. Both Diane and David, so long a perfect if toxic team, began to shift blame almost as soon as they felt the walls close in. Diane, sometimes sobbing, recounted a story in which David masterminded the murder, capitalizing on her insecurities, and cast herself as an unwilling accomplice, swept up by love, fear, and the residue of his manipulation. Her account focused on his planning, his procurement of the weapon, and his chilling nonchalance after the fact. She often darted between admissions and rationalizations, her words at times a swirl of self-reproach and desperate pleas for understanding. David, confronted separately with mounting evidence and the news that Diane had already confessed, wasted no time in redirecting guilt. He described Diane as obsessive, jealous to the point of derangement, and sketched a narrative where he was a victim of her emotional instability, a pawn driven by her threats and emotional leverage. In his telling, he tried to back out, to rein in Diane's most extreme demands, but in the end, he'd been forced to act out of fear for her safety and loyalty to a girl who would not let go. In his version, Diane fired the gun, Diane demanded secrecy, Diane was the true villain of the story. For authorities, the contrast between stories was both exasperating and illuminating. The truth, teased out from overlapping and conflicting confessions, was somewhere in the middle, a mutating alliance of ambition, envy, loyalty, and ruthlessness. Forensic evidence gave police their anchors: fibers, timelines, car mileage, and, most chillingly, Diane's own undated calendar entry documenting the night. There was also the emotional evidence, the anguish of their parents, the stunned silence in the academic institutions that had welcomed them as rising stars, the bubbling anger of a town long denied closure. The interrogations themselves became a duel of psychological endurance. Diane, who had mastered discipline in the classroom and on the field, now struggled to discipline her guilt and memory. She clung to the narrative that cast her as a broken soul, capable of monstrous acts only in extremis, only under the spell of her boyfriend's influence. She wept for her parents, for her own ruined future, and for the hope of forgiveness. David, whose charisma and composure had always drawn people in, tried to reassert control with calculated statements, hoping to show himself as rational, logical, ultimately less at fault. Their shifting stories soon made headlines. Word traveled fast. Every leaked confession, every legal maneuver, every slip of the tongue during indictment was fodder for a public both starved for resolution and horrified by the motives at play. The court of public opinion became a mirror of the actual proceedings. Some insisted Diane was coerced, others saw David as the puppet master. A few even insisted madness, not malice, had ruled the events of that night. No matter how often they attempted to shift the story, there was no escaping the hard evidence. Diane's writings, preserved in the form of journals, calendars, and emotionally charged letters, stitched together a timeline impossible to deny. David's confessions, recorded, reluctant but telling, matched details only a perpetrator would know. Both had burned bridges and trust so thoroughly that even their parents struggled to maintain faith in the innocence of the children they'd raised. The final reckoning played out not just in the station house or the courtroom, but in the slow, grinding agony of personal and public collapse. Friends and mentors, teachers and coaches, reporters and strangers, everyone watched as the story they thought they knew repeatedly mutated. The spectacle of the perfect couple fighting for their own lives, turning viciously on one another, added a layer of tragedy atop the killing itself. If someone could be so bright, so driven, yet hide such monstrous secrets, what did that say about the rest of the world? In private moments, Diane broke down entirely, alternating between confessions and desperate half-formed retractions, sometimes attempting to minimize her own complicity, sometimes insisting that the crime had been a fever dream she could not have controlled. David, pressed by his own family and defense lawyers to come clean, often resorted to icy silences or philosophical justifications, as if the enormity of what had happened could be tamed by logic. Ultimately, nothing could undo what they had done, nor could either outmaneuver the reality of their actions. When the official charges came, and the press descended with cameras and commentary, the story of their downfall became national news. Two celebrated young achievers, brought down by an act of violence as calculating as it was senseless, desperately trying to claw themselves out of a pit of their own making, by turning on the only person who truly understood their darkness. In Mansfield and in the wider world, the shattering of the lie was both a relief and a new sorrow, the relief of finally knowing, the sorrow of what knowing cost. The final judgment and the remaining darkness. When the day of reckoning finally arrived for Diane Zamora and David Graham, Mansfield was already a town forever changed. Yet as the courtroom doors swung open, and the two once promising cadets stood before judge and jury, a heavy air of anticipation, dread, and even a twisted sense of relief fell over everyone who had followed the case from its tragic beginning. The final phase, the sentencing and its aftermath, became not only a search for justice but a reckoning with larger questions of forgiveness, loss, and the long shadow cast by violence. Inside the courthouse, every seat was filled, families of the victim and the perpetrators, reporters scribbling furiously into their notepads, and dozens of townspeople who'd taken time off work just to witness the conclusion of a saga that had both gripped and wounded their community. There was no way to erase the images and feelings that had haunted Mansfield since Adrianne's body was discovered on that cold December morning. Now, every gaze was fixed on the two defendants, pale, exhausted, their once confident posture dissolved into anxious fidgets and downcast eyes. The judge's voice cut through the tense silence with the finality of a struck bell. Emotions in the room shifted from anger to sorrow and back again, as the story of the crime was recounted, piece by painstaking piece. The prosecution painted a devastating portrait: two gifted young people, blessed by opportunity, consumed by obsession and jealousy, conspiring with chilling calculation, and then executing the plan with equally cold resolve. The evidence, now familiar to all, carried new weight under oath. Diane's chilling calendar notations, David's attempts to fabricate an alibi, the horrifying detail in their separate confessions, and the haunting absence of remorse in the first days after their arrest. Adrianne's family sat in the front row, faces drawn with a mixture of vindication and a boundless, bottomless sadness. Her mother, every line of her posture a study in endurance, held a program from her daughter's memorial service crumpled in her fist. Her father's eyes, never leaving the defendants, flickered with the ache of someone trying to balance rage with the agony of letting his child go. At times, when the prosecution named Adrianne's bright spirit and described her future ripped away, soft sobs broke the hush, echoing along the marble walls. For Diane and David, the ordeal in court was both a culmination and a collapse. Their attempts at rationalization and self-defense, so carefully mounted in the first hours and days after their arrests, barely survived cross-examination. Each tried to minimize their own responsibility, shifting blame back and forth. Diane's lawyers claimed she was psychologically manipulated and broken down by David's ambition and controlling influence. David's counsel insisted he was a victim of Diane's extreme jealousy and emotional blackmail. It was a desperate, fracturing duet. In every plea, a refusal to fully acknowledge the horror they had wrought. In the jury's eyes, though, the line between victim and perpetrator was all but erased. Diane's intelligence and discipline, once celebrated, now appeared as cold calculation. David's charisma and charm, which had won him so many friends and mentors, crumbled under the hard scrutiny of motive and means. Their tears on the witness stand felt belated, their remorse impossible to separate from their desire for leniency. Every word uttered in court only seemed to underscore a core truth: this was not just a terrible mistake, but an act of willful, remorseless destruction of another life. The moment the sentences were handed down, life in prison for both, felt simultaneously like vindication and a kind of funeral. Not only had Adrianne Jones been laid to rest, but the lives of Diane Zamora and David Graham, once shining with promise, were also formally consigned to the annals of lost potential. The judge's closing remarks echoed with the weight of sorrow. Let this serve as a reminder that even those who seem to have everything are not immune to the ruinous undertow of unchecked emotion. No one cheered. The news, when it crackled out into the corridors, was met not with celebration but a hush. Justice had been served, but Mansfield's innocence had not been restored. In the aftermath, the town reeled from the public unraveling of its own mythology. Newspaper columns parsed every gesture, every whispered phrase from the trial. Parents consoled children who had known Diane and David as classmates, teammates, mentors, or even as friends. Teachers, stunned and hollowed, questioned if they had missed signs. Clergy wove the cautionary tale into Sunday sermons, trying to find meaning somewhere within the endless circles of guilt and consequence. Yet it was in quiet, private places that the darkness lingered longest. Adrianne's room, full of trophies and photographs, became a shrine to what might have been. Her parents faced a future marked by birthdays unsung and graduations uncelebrated. Elsewhere, the Zamora and Graham families bore their own sorrows, navigating the dual grief of losing children both to criminality and to a penal system that would never grant true solace. In hushed conversations, neighbors struggled with their new reality, one in which faith in simple goodness was forever bruised. The legal echo of the trial stretched far beyond Mansfield itself. Journalists and commentators, drawn by the drama and tragedy, dissected every moment for television screens and book deals. The story inspired movies, true crime investigations, and endless speculation online. What causes two seemingly exemplary teens to descend into homicide? Was it mental illness, toxic love, the quest for perfection, or some unfathomable confluence of fate and failing? The answers, never clear, never singular, became part of the tale's enduring enigma. Years passed, but the verdict continued to reverberate. The legal sentences, life, with possibility of parole after decades, stood as monuments to lost potential and a warning. In high schools around Texas and beyond, guidance counselors quietly updated protocols for spotting dangerous obsession. The Jones family, through public statements and quiet acts of advocacy, became symbols for victims' rights. Some Mansfield residents found hope in the belief that truth, however painful, had finally triumphed over secrecy. But others felt only the stubborn ache of longing, both for Adrienne and for the simpler era before her loss. On anniversaries and memorials, the story would resurface, sometimes told in the trembling voice of a survivor, sometimes in the measured tones of a local official, sometimes in the restless agitation of students determined that her tragic fate would not be in vain. There were always flowers on the fence near where Adrienne was found, fresh ribbons tied by hands that still refused to let the memory of that cold morning fade. In those small gestures and annual rituals, the community tried to knit itself back together, even as some wounds healed slowly, if at all. The final judgment settled over Mansfield not just as an endpoint but as a challenge to all who would remember. Vigilance, humility, and compassion matter far more than brilliance or ambition. In every classroom, church, and family room, echoes of the case became reminders of what could happen, not just in textbooks or news stories but right next door, among our own. For those who lived through the ordeal, the ultimate darkness was not just the crimes themselves but the realization that even in peaceful communities, there are vulnerabilities waiting for tragedy to slip through. Years after the verdict, people could still recall the details: the moonlit field, the humble farmhouse, the dreams cut short and the futures never lived. The memory of Adrienne Jones, and the consequences faced by those who took her life, became embedded in the very fabric of Mansfield, the last lesson etched into the hearts of a town determined never to forget.